something that we're going to see become very salient was just how much technology had changed because of the industrial era, really. Uh, we take for granted that there were such enormous changes in the economy as well as technology in metallurgy, in chemistry, and in high precision mass production. And this affected weapons as well as every other imaginable uh, economic sector. And then once the war started, that process accelerated even further. So there had already been significant weapons advances that hadn't really been used uh, before 1914, and the generals in charge really didn't understand how that was going to affect the battlefields. So the stalemate that developed during the First World War couldn't be broken until the generals figured out what to do with the power that the Industrial Revolution had given them. This had given them all kinds of new weapons that they had no idea how to use effectively. And we take for granted how rapid the change was. And it's easy for us now to look back on the First World War and think, why couldn't they wrap their heads around these weapons? Well, weapon development had been pretty slow before that point. Gunpowder didn't even reach Europe until the 13th century, the 1200s. It was brought by Mongol invaders, and the process by which gunpowder could be used effectively in warfare was extremely slow. It took 300 years really for gunpowder to be used more effectively in guns or muskets. So rifled artillery had become much better over the past 50 years. Artillery before about the 1860s, the American Civil War, had not been rifled before that. And after the American Civil War, that's when things really began to change with artillery and rifle technology. The new machine tools in the industrial factories made new ways of casting metal possible that made the manufacture of identical parts uh, available in infinite numbers. And so that cleared the way for modern firearms, for the locomotive, for internal combustion engine, and really accelerated war to something beyond what anybody thought possible before. The chemical industry changed too, and things like smokeless gunpowder or dynamite massively changed the battlefield. But the generals didn't really understand this because there hadn't been a war in Europe since 1850, or a major war in Europe since 1815, and so there was kind of a lag in understanding what the technology was capable of, uh, and between that and being able to use the technology effectively. A guy named Hiram Maxim, who was an American inventor, he basically invented the machine gun, and what he was able to achieve was use the force that smokeless powder puts into a gun's recoil and gas discharge to empty the spent cartridges, reload the chamber, and then fire again in an endless sequence. And then you cool the process with water in his original gun. And as long as the gun was cooled, it could fire for hours at that rate. His Maxim's machine gun could pour out 600 rounds per minute. So that gave an enormous advantage in war to the defense. But that was something generals had trouble understanding or trouble accepting in some ways. Even the rifles that soldiers carried during the First World War were astonishing weapons compared to anything previously available. Most of the rifles that the soldiers in the belligerent nations had were pretty similar. The German, French, British, Austrian versions of the rifles, they were all about 4 feet long. They weighed about 10 pounds or less, a little bit less. They were equipped with bolt actions, and they fired metal cartridges of approximately 30 caliber, fed from magazines that contained 5 to 10 rounds. All of them were capable of putting bullets into a bullseye at a range of hundreds of yards. And in the hands of a well trained infantry, they were so much more lethal than any of the muskets that were available even 40 years prior. At the time of the Franco Prussian War, the muskets were just that much less accurate, far more accurate in the First World War. And all that change had happened without generals being able to wrap their minds around it. So that was significant. Other technology changes that were significant were the engineering, the mining that enabled soldiers to learn how to dig more effectively, and that would become important, um, as well as the various high profile weapons. So, probably the most blatant or the most obvious of the technological advances was in naval warfare with the launch of the dreadnought class of battleships, which Britain pioneered. So the HMS Dreadnought, British naval battleship, launched in 1906. It was bigger than anything that came before it, and it was such a shock to the rest of the Western nations. They all felt they had to compete, and so this created an arms race where the British built a dreadnought, Germans built their own dreadnought-like ships. The Italians built some, the French built some, the Americans built some, and so every country was trying to race with the other to build more and more naval warships. And battleships were extremely expensive. This represented kind of a lot what was crazy about the First World War. Battleships were extremely expensive to construct, extremely expensive to operate and maintain, and there's really no point to them except to kill other battleships. That's why you build one. A battleship is designed to kill other battleships, and therefore you don't actually want to use it, because if you use your battleship, you put it at risk to the other side's battleship. And if you lose yours, then obviously that's really bad. You've lost all those resources. They had huge crews of thousands of sailors and used a ton of resources, and obviously were these huge hunks of metal. So, but once they started building them bigger and bigger, all the countries felt the need to catch up. The Dreadnought class was the brainchild of a British admiral named Sir John Fisher, who was convinced that just the bigger and faster a ship could be, the better it was, and he really pushed for Britain to build these huge ships. Another factor in the war were the technologies that went away, and so we'll talk about them as well. But two technologies that went away in war that were once very important were cavalry, and because obviously soldiers on horses are pretty useless against these rapid fire weapons and very accurate artillery. But the British and French in particular were really stuck on cavalry for a long time. And then the use of the bayonet. Soldiers trained with bayonets quite a lot in the expectation that they might get into hand-to-hand combat, but that actually didn't happen so much, despite the persistence of the generals in training their soldiers to do such a thing. So when hand-to-hand, ironically, when hand-to-hand combat did occur in World War One, a lot of soldiers would just throw down their weapons when they ran out of ammunition and use their shovels, or some of them carried brass knuckles in order to fight hand-to-hand. When it did occur, the bayonets were actually fairly useless for a lot of reasons. Usually they'd get stuck when you try to use them. So, but it was 19th century thinking, and so one big takeaway about the technology, the dichotomy between the technology and the thinking of the early 20th century, is that the people in charge of the conflict had 19th century thinking, and they were creatures of the 19th century, but the technology was very much born out of the 20th century.